Well, it's good to see every one of you here this morning, and we have a guest speaker, a very special guest speaker to our family, our church family, and his name is Nathan York, and he is making preparations to go into the ministry through Indiana Wesleyan University, and he is finishing up his undergraduate as we speak, papers being written probably in his head right now, and all that sort of thing, and then he's beginning preliminary work for his seminary, which will include class time next year as well as on church site. And we like to make ourselves available as a church for someone who is in training to learn and to grow. You guys are a good crowd to preach to most Sundays. But before he comes up there, I just want to give you a quick word for those of you who are members of the church. Last weekend, we had an amazing gathering of ministry leaders and many of the small group leaders. And we just kind of reviewed as a church. This is where God has been leading us since last fall with our leadership retreat. And we shared about challenges and opportunities which seem to go hand in hand in your life and in our lives. And so we started asking and got great feedback from people, and there's just a great spirit in that meeting, a great sense of unity, and God just loves unity. There's enough church fighting going on, and not here, I'm just saying in the world, and to see unity is a beautiful thing. We've been blessed with that as a congregation. Then we finished the meeting with a fantastic time of prayer. We just kind of circled up, and we just recommitted ourselves. We consecrated ourselves to the God's service, and then people said, we really need to somehow recreate that with the rest of the body as much as possible. And so last week I said, hey, pencil in a time. I'm not going to tell you any of that because we started thinking, it'd work better logistically and to create a better environment for communication is if we just had the same meeting after church for the next 3 Sundays. And so starting this Sunday, 15 minutes after the service in the youth room, the members of the elders and some of the equipping team or staff team, we're going to be there. We're basically going to just give you a quick summary of what was shared and then have a time of question and answer and prayer and that sort of thing. But we put the information on the Facebook page, and some people thought, okay, is it like you got to be there every week for this sort of thing? No, we wouldn't do that to you. It's a standalone. It's not a part one, part two, part three. Nope. It's a single meeting. I get paid to communicate, and I still don't communicate well, even when we try to type something up, and I say, hey, would you proofread this? And so that's our bad on that front. So anyways, this Sunday, next Sunday, and the following Sunday, 15 minutes after the service, go to the youth room where there's red couches, and you can hear some really cool things that's happening in the life of our church. I'm just excited about what God can do, and I hope you will join us in that. And we started a series last week on the book of Ruth, and it's entitled Finding Love in the Midst of Loss, and how God works behind the scenes. And so today, Nathan is going to take us from chapter 1, where we spent last week, into chapter 2. So please welcome Nathan York.
Thank you very much, Doug, and thank you guys for just allowing me to come back here. I interned with this church about 2 summers ago, and really enjoyed my time here and enjoyed getting to know all of you. And it's just so awesome to be back and get to worship with all you guys again. My family's here; they came out to support me, and boy, the weather is just gorgeous right now. I am so grateful for that. But before we get any further into what God's put on my heart, I got a video I want you guys to watch. So I'll just step back.
Morning, everybody. Let's get started. Kenny?
At 7, I'm going to throw your newspaper into the bushes.
Can you make it 7:30 when the sprinklers come on?
Done.
Ned?
At 10:45, I'll let you know that a computer virus totally wiped out your hard drive.
Terrific. Janine?
On your way to the client presentation, you're going to blow a tire and have to walk across town to get there.
Will it be raining?
Hard.
Great. Becky, anything to add? You're still going to be giving me the silent treatment for no apparent reason. Awesome. Good thing I had my orange juice.
Take on the day with the natural goodness of 100% pure Florida orange juice.
Has anybody ever seen that commercial? Can anybody relate to that commercial? I know I can. There are just some days there just doesn't seem to go your way. Nothing seems to go your way. And sometimes there are a series of days that never seem to go your way. And I mean, at least that guy's got his orange juice. That's how he gets by. But maybe you relate a little bit differently. Maybe your computer hard drive crashed. Maybe your car tire broke down, or maybe it's something more serious for you. Doug talked about Ruth chapter 1, and in their life, they experienced a lot of death. That was their series of events, their series of bad days that really hit them. Naomi, her husband died tragically in the middle of a famine in a foreign land. And her 2 sons died after they had just gotten married during a famine in a foreign land. And that's where Ruth is at. Ruth, her father-in-law died. Her husband died. Her brother-in-law died. They were just experiencing a series of losses, a series of really bad days. Maybe you've experienced loss like that. Or maybe you've experienced maybe it's at work for you. Maybe you're having tension at work with some coworkers, or maybe the problem with work is that you don't have work right now, and that's the tension. Or maybe it's at home and there's just a series of conflicts or arguments or little underlying things that rub you wrong that never seem to go away, and maybe that's what's piling on. Or maybe it's logistical things like a car or an apartment. For me, I've been buried under a pile of homework for the last month. Like Doug said, I'm finishing up my undergrad this month. I graduate April 30th, which is super exciting. Thank you. But it's also super stressful. I have so many papers I have to write, and I have so many presentations I have to give. Next week, I have to give a presentation I've been working on for the last 4 semesters. Tell me that's not high pressure. On top of I work 2 jobs, and I'm getting married in a month as well. So my fiance's back there in the back. She's the one smiling, trying to hide. But so between those 2 things and working 2 jobs, I'm not going to try to compare it to Ruth's situation or Naomi's situation. I'm very blessed to have those kind of problems. But I can identify with just one thing piling on after another and after another. And that's kind of where Ruth and Naomi were. It was just one thing after another after another. And if you remember, the book of Ruth takes place somewhere during the book of Judges. And the time of Judges was just a bad time for Israel. I mean, they were blessed because they've always lived in the promised land. They've always lived in the land that God had told them they were going to live in. And they'd always heard about people like Moses and Joshua. They'd always heard about the stories of the 10 Commandments, the stories of the plagues, how Joshua led the military campaign to defeat the giants that were in the land that they're now living in. But you know what? They never had to live that. They never experienced any of that. They didn't know what that was like. So they never owned their faith. They didn't rely on God like the people before them did. So they didn't have to. So the time of the Judges was a time of economic, civil, and spiritual chaos. This was a time where, generally speaking, the Israelites didn't have any money. They were generally captives to another people group. They didn't have a king, and they had no moral compass. And this was especially troubling for people like Ruth and Naomi, because even under the perfect circumstances, Ruth and Naomi were widows. And in that day, women's rights were tied up in the rights of the men that they were in relation to. So Naomi's rights were tied up into her husband, and Ruth's rights were tied up in her husband and her father. And they didn't have either one of them. So what this meant for them is that they were homeless. They had no job, no money, and no food. And what this also meant for them is that they had no rights. They had no protection. They had no security or safety. Ruth and Naomi had nothing at this point. And that's where we pick up the story in Ruth chapter 2. If you guys will stand with me as we read the word here. I'm going to start in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, which was her husband, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I might find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Then Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "This is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the woman who worked for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I've told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars they have filled." After this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes, that you would notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I have been told about all you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and your mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you didn't know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wing you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I have not the standing of even one of your servants." This is the word of the Lord. You can be seated. What I want to point out first here is where the author of Ruth starts, where God starts in his inspiration of the story. And it's with a verse of hope. It's with a verse that says Naomi had a relative on her husband's side that was living there named Boaz. Now to us, it's like, okay, fun fact. But to them, that was hope. Because like I said, their rights and their lives were tied up in their relatives. So the fact that they had a relative nearby who might be able to take care of them was huge. Now, we're told this reading the story, but it doesn't necessarily mean Naomi and Ruth would have known that. They've been gone a while. They might not know where Boaz is. But we're given an insight into what God is doing behind the scenes here. Something that God is going to unravel as he goes. So diving into the actual story, diving into the narrative that we see, Ruth decides that she has to take action. Like we said, they have no food. They have no shelter. They're going to die on the street unless something is done. And at this point, Naomi is still grieving. They're just sitting in the circle, and Naomi is still grieving. She's still bitter. She's still angry at God, which she has right to be to some point. But if they would have continued that pattern, they would have died. So Ruth has to take a step up and do something risky. Ruth decides to go out into the fields and look for food, which to us, it's like, okay, that's the natural thing to do, right? But for her, that was really risky. Again, she had no rights. The fields were a secluded place. Anything could have happened to her out there. And because this was the time of Judges, at the end of Judges, it says everyone did what was right in their eyes. Because this was the time of Judges, anyone could have done anything without hardly any concern of being in trouble for it. Yes, there was a Jewish law, there was an Israelite law, but that law was not enforced. She put herself in harm's way to try to do what she thought needed to be done, to try to get food. And as we see in verse 5, Boaz catches on to this. Boaz gets back and he sees her working there, and he doesn't recognize her. He doesn't know her. He's never met her before, even though she's family. He's never met her before. So he asks his servant, "Who is this woman? Who does she belong to?" is how he says it, which is their way of saying, like, whose husband, whose wife is that? Whose daughter is that? And he can't respond with, "This is someone's wife," or "This is someone's daughter." She doesn't have any. He responds, "This is a foreigner from the land of Moab." By the way, Moab and Israel did not have a great history together. Moab was one of the people groups that oppressed Israel at different points in time. So this wouldn't have been the greatest title for a woman in her vulnerable position to have. But he goes on and he says, "This is the woman from Moab who came back with Naomi." Okay, now the situation's changed a little bit. She came back with Naomi, and the story of what had happened to her and what had happened to Naomi must have spread by now. Because that's all that needs to be said for Boaz to understand. It must have been a small town mentality there in Bethlehem, because he knew what had happened, and then he reaches out to her. He knew what had happened. Somehow God had orchestrated for Ruth to end up in his field. In verse 3, it says, as it so happened, he was in her field. She was in his field. As it so happened. Some people might look at that as a coincidence, but in the context, this is God. And we don't know whether or not she knew about Boaz. She may have known about Boaz, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. God stopped the famine, gave a harvest, and brought her to a place where she could maybe be taken care of. Maybe, if Boaz would do it. So we move on and see Boaz's response. And he says, don't glean in any other field. Don't go away from here. I've told my men to take care of you. You now have food. You now have a shelter, at least for the day. You now have water. And I'm not giving you a bodyguard, but none of these guys are going to be a threat to you. Which is a huge blessing for Ruth. She took a risk. She took a step. And Boaz did not take advantage of her. What's important to recognize here is that not only was Boaz doing something kind, but this was actually something that God had orchestrated a long time ago. Back when, in the story of Moses, God gave a bunch of laws. He gave like 560 laws or something like that, a lot of laws. But some of them had to do with this kind of scenario. There was laws that instructed farmers to leave food in their fields for the poor and for the foreigners and for the widows. There were laws that said to watch out for the people who can't take care of themselves. There were laws that guided Boaz's actions here. So if you take a step back and don't know anything about God, you could say, okay, he's just a nice guy. Thankfully, she ended up in the right field at the right time with the right guy. That's a lot of coincidences. It's a lot of coincidences. And she wasn't in the business of coincidences. She didn't have very good luck at this point. But then we see Ruth's response. She wasn't ready for that. She didn't expect that. She didn't know what to expect. She went into this field not knowing what to expect. She knew what could have happened. She knew what she didn't want to happen. But she wasn't expecting this kind of grace. All Boaz had to do, according to the law, was say, okay, yeah, you can take my leftovers. That's all the law required him to do. And again, no one cared about the law. Everybody did what they wanted to do. So he could have sent her away, and no one would have batted an eye at him. Wouldn't have been a big deal. But he doesn't. And she recognizes that. And she says, why have you been so gracious to me, a foreigner, a widow, part of a people group that you don't get along with? Why have you been so gracious to me? She didn't see God's hand in it. She missed it. She thought it was a coincidence. And then we see his response. After she bowed her face to the ground in humility and thankfulness, he says, I've heard about the love and the faithfulness that you've had towards your mother-in-law. I've heard about the risks you've taken going away from your home, going away from the security that you could have had. She could have gone back home. She could have gotten back with her mom and her dad, could have married somebody else and let Naomi take care of herself. And that would have been totally okay. No one would have frowned upon her for that. But she didn't. She went with Naomi, and Boaz says, I've heard about the way that you're trying to take care of your mother-in-law. I recognize that, and God sees that. He says, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wing you have come to take refuge. And maybe that's when it clicked. Maybe that's when she started to realize there's a bigger plan at stake here. Because you see, Moab didn't worship the God of Israel. Moab didn't worship our God. Moab worshiped other gods. We don't know how much she would have known about Yahweh. We don't know how much she would have known about the God of Israel. We're not told. We don't know how much time elapsed between her getting married to an Israelite and this encounter here. It's possible all she knew about was Naomi saying, God cursed me. God doesn't like me. God's angry. God is an angry God. It's possible that's all she knew. It's also possible she could have known, she could have been told, and she could have heard the stories, but she'd never experienced it. All she'd experienced was an angry God that was angry at her family. And Boaz flips it. Boaz says, no. Let the God reward you. Let him take care of you. Have faith and trust in him. And she responds with, okay, let it be so. May I continue to find favor in your eyes. This has a dual meaning. Your eyes, as in you, Boaz, and possibly even your eyes, as in God. May I continue to find favor in your eyes. And that's where this passage ends. That's where my passage ends. And you guys are going to dive into this more as you go throughout this sermon series. But that's all we're told as of now. That's all we've got. But you know what? That's hope for Ruth. That's hope for Naomi. Their problems weren't fixed yet. God could have, but he didn't raise their family from the grave. He could have, but he didn't. God could have given them a place to live. God could have given them a field of their own. God didn't just swoop down and fix the problem. God gave them hope. And that's all they've got right now. But you know what? It seems like that was good enough for Ruth. Seems like that was good enough for her. You put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants, though I don't deserve it. You've been kind to me, though I don't deserve it. I've done nothing to deserve this. She's thankful for the grace and the hope that she's been given, at least for the time of the harvest, which lasts about a couple months. At least for the time of the harvest, she has food, and she has a place she can go in the day to be taken care of. Now, sure, what happens when she goes home? When she goes back to the town square, she can only take as much food as she can carry, right? We all know how big of a woman she was, but she can only take as much as she can carry. So, and she has no place to store it, so it's not like she can hoard it up for after the harvest is over. What happens after the harvest is over? What's going to happen to Naomi and Ruth when Ruth comes back with all this food sitting next to somebody else who doesn't have any food, who wants the food? Or what happens to Naomi and Ruth when they're sleeping out on the street and no one else is around to protect them? No one else is being told not to touch them. What's going to happen to Naomi and Ruth then? Well, we aren't told. God's plan is still unraveling, but for now it is enough. For now, that's enough for Ruth. And as you continue out the story, you see that God continues to be faithful with her. And I'm not going to spoil any of Doug's future sermons. But Ruth responds with thankfulness. And there's a lot we can take from this short 13 verses. I mean, like we said, we can all relate to the dad on the screen who's just having a bad day. We can all relate to having multiple bad days. Maybe we can all relate to bad days as bad as this. But if you're there right now, can you see where God's starting to open the door a little bit? Can you see the light starting to shine through at the end of the tunnel yet? Think about that for a second. If you're in that stage of life, what little things are happening that are good things that you might be rationalizing away because they're not big things? This wasn't a big thing. What little things is God bringing into your life right now? If you're not seeing those little things yet, that's okay. They didn't see them at first either. God didn't show them at first. We're shown the breadcrumb trail before they are, right? In verse 1, we're told that, but they weren't told that. God was working behind the scenes even before they saw it, so why would it be any different for us? God is working behind the scenes for our good even before we recognize it. So if you don't see it yet, that's okay, but do you believe that it'll be there? Are you counting on him to open that door for you? Are you counting on him to let a job interview go through, to get a call back? Are you counting on him to get you through the pain of a loved one being lost, or through the pain of losing a friend, or through the pain of homework? Are you counting on him to get you through those planning stages or whatever it might be? Do you believe that that will come? Because it will. And perhaps you do see the light. Perhaps you are starting to see it, and perhaps it's exciting. But do you recognize it as God that's doing it? Or do you pat yourself on the back and say, I pushed through, I did my hard work, I earned that? And sure, you did. But was it all you? Was it all coincidence? Was it all good luck? Or did God have something to do with it? Are you looking for him in the middle of that? Are you recognizing him in the middle of that? Are you giving him the credit he deserves? And you know, if you don't see it, if nothing is happening for you right now and you're just saying, no, Nathan, none of this applies to me, my life just still sucks. Well, okay, that's fair. Maybe you don't see it yet. Maybe you don't see the light, and maybe the light that God is like shining through at the end of the tunnel. But that's okay. My question to you then is, are you putting yourself in a position where God can work? Like Ruth? Are you putting yourself in a risky position to where God can do something? Or are you Naomi, who's sitting over here and saying, my life sucks, I'm not going to do anything about it yet? Because if you are acting like Ruth, if you are doing what you know you can do and counting on God for the rest, it'll come through eventually. It takes time sometimes, and I'm sorry for that. But it'll come through eventually. You just have to keep your faith. Maybe for some of you, you're past that point, and you're into the clear. You've come out of the tunnel, you've come out of the hole, you've come out of the pit, whatever dark analogy you want to use. And you're past it, and you're happy for that. Are you grateful for that? Are you thankful for that in the way that Ruth was? Did you get down on your knees and say, thank you, God, for providing this for me? Did you get down on your face and say, I didn't deserve this, but thank you? Because we don't. He blesses us beyond what we deserve. He loves us that way. We're fortunate that way, even if we always think we are. And guys, we even have an advantage over Ruth and Naomi because we've got all of this. They had like that. They had a couple of books of the Bible that talked about how God did crazy things in the lives of people, which is awesome. But they didn't have all the stories that we have. And you know what? They didn't have Jesus yet. What's your cup of orange juice that you take at the end of a bad day? So you know what? At least I've got this. Do you stand over here and say, well, at least I've got family? That's a great thing. I've got my family here. I really appreciate it. That's a great thing. That's what Naomi did at the beginning. There's a famine. I have no food, but at least I've got family. That's good. Do you stand over here and say, well, things suck, but at least I've got my body. I can still work. I can still do things. I can work my way out of this. That was Ruth's mindset. That's my mindset sometimes. It's like, okay, I can work through this. Just bury myself in work. Hard times, sometimes people bury themselves in what they're good at. And that's okay. But maybe we should stand over here and say, you know what, at least I've got Jesus. But no, that's corny, so we're not going to say that. But, at least we've got Jesus. We've got a God who loves us so much that before we even cared about him, he died for us. We have a God that loves us so much that he sent his son to die. Not only did he have to grieve for him, but he sent him to die because he loves us. We have a God who loves us so much that he took the beatings and the punishments of our sins that he didn't deserve, that we deserve. He took those for us because he wants better for us, because he wants us to get past the beatings of life and to his blessings for our life. More than that, we have a God who raised himself from the dead to prove that he can overcome so that we can overcome. Man, at least we've got Jesus. Life might be tough, but at least we've got Jesus. At the end of the day, like the song said, he's all we need. So I want to ask you, what would it take for you to come from the grieving period that is necessary, that you should go through, that Doug talked about last week in chapter 1, that you need to go through? I want to emphasize that. That's a good period. But what does it take to transition from that period over time into where Ruth is at? To, all right, let's start putting the pieces back together. What will it take for you to start looking for the light at the end of the tunnel? For you to start taking those steps of faith, even if you don't have a lot of faith, to improve it? What will it take for you to trust that God will provide? You guys pray with me. God, thank you for the story of Ruth. I mean, really, it's the story of our lives. We live in a time of chaos and confusion and the hustle and bustle, and we don't know what we're doing half the time. We have no idea what you're doing. But thank you for the fact that we can trust and know with absolute certainty that you are working for our good, because you say it so many times and you have proved it so many times in the lives of people around us, in the lives of people in the past, and in our lives as well. Thank you for proving that, God, and help us to lean more into you and to rely on you more for that. Help me to do that, God. And if there's anyone here who doesn't understand what that means, or who hasn't experienced that kind of confidence in you, or who doesn't have that relationship with you to where they can do that, I just pray that you'll move them today to take a step of faith, to do something about it. I pray for the hearts of those people here who are hurting, who experience any sort of loss or struggle, who are just having that bad day. I pray that you will transform that bad day into something that glorifies you, God. You can redeem anything, and even though you don't cause the pain, you redeem it, and you want to make it better for us. Help us to take those steps and to let you make it better, God. I pray that you help us focus on you as we sing these next couple songs, and just be grateful for what you've given us and surrender what we haven't given you.